All right, hello and welcome to the video lectures for the persuasive essay. This, of course, is our last essay of the quarter, and of course, we'll be employing all of the strategies that we've used thus far in the quarter. So we'll be using things like finding and explaining evidence, which we started practicing with a literary analysis essay, and we'll be using things like rhetorical devices and thinking about rhetorical appeals that you examined in the rhetorical analysis essay. And in this case, you'll be choosing a topic, whatever you like, to write about, and your goal is to convince an audience of something. Who and what and how is entirely up to you, but these videos will be intended to help you try and figure out who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and how you're going to convince your audience. So the first thing is to think about, what skills we've learned this quarter, what things we've been practicing, because there's actually quite a lot that we've covered. So in particular, we've talked about critical reading or close reading, thesis statements, identifying author and purpose and things like that. And there are a lot of things that should be relatively honed at this point, even if you feel like there's more to learn or more to work on. But there's a lot here that we've worked on. And so I would really encourage you to think about the persuasive essay as a way to sort of highlight or showcase all of the things that you've learned thus far. So as we move into the persuasive essay, it's important to kind of step backwards to the rhetorical analysis essay for a second and think about how often there are attempts to persuade us. And it is all the time. A lot of the time it's to get us to buy something, which is probably the most common, or maybe vote a certain way or complete a survey or something like that. And there are a lot of ways that companies and individuals try to persuade us, whether that's by celebrity endorsement or a claim that something is trusted by moms or whatnot. But all of these things are strategies that are intended to convince a specific audience of something. So now, as we think about persuasion, again, we're shifting from the rhetorical analysis, which was unpacking how others persuade us, to think about how we might use those tools for ourselves, right? So we might want to think about why we want to persuade somebody of something. Maybe it's in our best interest. Maybe we need someone to do us a favor. And then we want to think about the tools that we can use and what we might need to take into consideration if we are trying to persuade somebody. And again, that takes into account things like audience and purpose and who we are as the speaker, what our role is, what experience we bring. So you can kind of go back to that idea of soapstone that we talked about with the rhetorical analysis essay. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about if you're trying to convince somebody is looking at how these things are successful in the real world. And we've looked at tweets and things like that, but it's interesting to look at the CMV or Change My View Reddit. And the idea behind this thread was that people would create an original post about their beliefs and open it up for other people to challenge their beliefs and try to convince them to change that belief or opinion. And this was studied very closely, and there have been academic studies on this. There were over 200,000 subscribers at the time. So I want you to think for a moment about the things that you think would have been most successful in this situation, where primarily what they had was a text-based system in which to challenge somebody's beliefs or opinions. Now, what they found, according to the article Winning Arguments, which was an academic study, there were 6 things, and these are in order, that were most effective in convincing people to change their view or opinion. Number 1 were first and second person pronouns, so things like I and you. The second was links to outside sources, so evidence or logos. Hedging, or admitting that maybe there are other situations or other considerations that could be taken into account. Examples, so theoretical or practical, asking questions, and using quotations. So we can see that about half of these things, 3 out of 6, were based on actual information. So the person was using evidence in order to become even more persuasive. So now I think that what the first person pronouns and the hedging are highlighting is that there's a difference between arguing and persuading. And I've already talked a little bit about the difference between persuading someone and manipulating them. But manipulating really just means that you're being devious and malicious and not really working in good faith to try and convince something, kind of, which, if we're convincing somebody or persuading somebody, the ultimate decision is up to them. So sometimes, we kind of talk about persuasive essays and argumentative essays interchangeably, but I do think it's pretty important to reframe this because I don't think that they're exactly interchangeable. And I think that thinking about something as argumentative puts a little bit of the wrong spin on it. So I want you to think about this for a second and think about what the difference is between persuading somebody or arguing with somebody. And I would say that there are differences in the goals and the approach. So if we think about the goals of a persuasive essay, we're really just trying to convince a reader to take an action, change an opinion, something like that. And if we're writing something that's argumentative, we're really just trying to say that the other person is wrong and that we are right. And it's important to think about the fact that we actually use words like winning and losing when we talk about an argument. And we know that no one wants to admit that they're wrong in an argument. And so in terms of approach, we assume, right, in persuasion, that the other person has a different opinion, but with kind of the right information, that other person is going to change their mind. And I think that's why the CMV Reddit works, is because, hey, here's some other information that maybe you didn't have or didn't know about that could change your mind. And hey, I might be wrong, but you might want to go look at this. In an argument, we really assume that we are right and the other person is wrong, and we kind of start from this place where the other person must disagree with us. So usually in an argument, we don't try to see the other sides of things or be faithful or honest, and sometimes even mischaracterize the other person's ideas. So if we're doing an argumentative essay and we are seeking to argue, we want to prove that we're right. We may not give a correct course of action or acknowledge counter arguments. We're probably going to focus primarily on pathos, primarily through things like word choice and images or imagery. And oftentimes things are, sort of exaggerated or taken to the extreme. And you can see this if you think about the arguments that maybe you've participated in or maybe witnessed. So an example of something like this that would be a argumentative approach to a topic would be this one. And the topic is just voting, but it's in an argumentative vein. So note that the use of the word unpatriotic is going to really put some readers or listeners off right away. People are going to go on the defensive, and there's really little effort to say here why voting should be required, only the suggestion that it's unpatriotic if people don't vote. So if we want to, we could change this, and we're going to look at that in a second here. We could change the wording to be a little bit more open, and that's going to work towards more persuasion, especially, again, remember, we're trying to convince people, and if people go on the defensive, we're going to put ourselves at a disadvantage. So opposite or different from an argumentative essay, a persuasive essay, the goal here is really to convince somebody to take an action, change a policy, reverse an opinion. And it's generally something that takes into account counter arguments and maybe even refutes them by saying, hey, I see that this is what you're thinking, but let me explain to you why there's this other information that counters that. So one of the main things to think about is that a persuasive essay is not an opinion piece. Opinion is based primarily on preferences, and persuasion takes into account why we have those preferences and kind of rationalize them a little bit. So just be aware that, there are a lot of terms that English instructors throw out there: persuasive, argumentative, opinion, and to my mind, they are different. An opinion piece is just kind of saying, hey, here's where I stand. Here's what I think about this as, a person or as somebody that has a vested interest. And there may be some sort of persuasive components to that. So here's an example of that same, sort of sentiment that I presented earlier, but in this case, it's going to be a little bit more persuasive. It's unlikely that people are going to be kind of put on the defensive right away. I mean, some people might, and that's just kind of the nature of communication. But I would say there are fewer people that would go on the defensive, primarily because we're talking about the importance of something, and maybe we could delve a little bit more into why it's important. Okay, so as you think about what you want to write about for your persuasive essay, I want you to think about how you word your claim. right? You don't want a claim that's going to put people on the defensive right away, because if they're on the defensive, especially with a written piece, they're just going to have the tendency to want to stop reading, and it's going to be impossible to convince somebody of something if they're not reading or not listening. So again, when we think of persuasive, it's a little bit more nuanced, it's a little bit subtler, and so really kind of think about wording and word choice here as well. Okay, so there we go. I'll pause this video there, stop this video here, and I'll pick up with the next video. So questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, recipes. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later.